At exactly 8:17 p.m. in front of 32 guests under a chandelier that cost more than my car. My sister-in-law slapped me so hard my wine glass shattered in my hand. Red Cabernet ran down my wrist. Someone laughed. And my husband did nothing. If you've ever been humiliated by people who were supposed to be your family, pause for a second and subscribe. Because what happened that night didn't end with a slap. It ended with the truth they tried to bury. But I didn't know that yet. All I knew was that the room smelled like expensive perfume, roasted salmon, and embarrassment. My name is Hannah Carter. I'm 30 years old. I live in Scottsdale, Arizona. And until that night, I believed that if you worked hard enough to be accepted into a family, eventually they would stop treating you like an outsider. I was wrong. The party was for my mother-in-law, Lorraine Whitmore's 65th birthday. Lorraine Whitmore was the kind of woman who referred to herself in the third person and had a florist on retainer. The Whitmore family owned Whitmore Custom Homes, a regional construction company worth somewhere around $22 million, depending on the market. They didn't just build houses, they built status. My husband, Daniel Whitmore, was the eldest son, calm, polished, the face of the company's next generation. And me, I was the scholarship girl from Flagstaff who met him in graduate school. I worked as a licensed escrow officer managing real estate closings. Numbers made sense to me. Documents told the truth even when people didn't. Apparently that was my first mistake. The slap came from Rebecca Whitmore, Daniel's younger sister. Rebecca had perfect hair, perfect nails, and absolutely no tolerance for accidents involving her silk dress. Because yes, the slap happened after I accidentally spilled wine, but that wasn't why she hit me. Not really. Let me explain. Earlier that evening, Lorraine insisted on a formal toast. Crystal glasses were passed around. Daniel handed me a glass himself. "Smile," he whispered. "Just get through tonight." That should have been my warning. I turned to step back toward the table when someone brushed past me hard. The wine tipped. A splash across Rebecca's pale blue dress. A gasp. 1 second of silence. Then, crack! Her palm across my face. "You ruined it," she said. Not shouted. Said, like she was correcting a mistake. And then someone laughed. I remember that laugh more than the slap. It came from Daniel's cousin Mark. Then Lorraine chuckled. Actually chuckled. "Oh, Hannah," she said, waving a hand dismissively. "You really must learn to be more careful." No one asked if I was okay. No one told Rebecca that hitting someone was wrong. They were amused. That was the moment something inside me shifted. But I stayed quiet, because humiliation in public is a test, and I wanted to see how far they'd go. Let me ask you something. If you were standing there, face-stinging glass cutting into your palm, people laughing, would you leave, or would you stay and watch? I stayed. Daniel finally spoke, but not to defend me. "Let's not make this dramatic," he murmured. Not dramatic. Blood was literally running down my hand. Rebecca dabbed her dress with a napkin. Lorraine called for another bottle of wine. The party continued, as if nothing had happened. But something had. Because while I was in the powder room 10 minutes later, rinsing Cabernet out of a paper towel and staring at my reflection, I realized something strange. No one had come to check on me. Not Daniel. Not anyone. And that absence felt deliberate, like they expected me to disappear quietly. That's when I noticed the envelope in my purse. I hadn't put it there. Cream-colored, heavy paper, addressed to me, in Lorraine's handwriting. I hadn't opened it yet, and I didn't know why she'd given it to me without saying a word. But standing there, face still burning, I suddenly had the feeling the slap wasn't the worst thing that was going to happen that night. It was just the beginning. Because families like the Whitmores don't humiliate you by accident. They do it when they've already decided your place. I dried my hands, tucked the envelope back into my purse, and went back out to the party, smiling. Because if they thought embarrassment would make me small, they didn't know what I did for a living. I read contracts, and contracts reveal intent. I hadn't opened Lorraine's envelope yet, but I would. Just not there, not in front of them. Not until I was ready to understand why my name was on it. And why Daniel wouldn't look me in the eye. Chapter 2 begins with what was inside that envelope, and the first lie I could actually prove. At 10:42 p.m., I sat alone in my car in the Whitmore driveway with the engine off, the party still going behind me and Lorraine Whitmore's envelope resting on my lap. I didn't open it right away, because sometimes you already know something is wrong. You just don't know how wrong yet. If you've ever held a piece of paper that you knew could change the way you see people forever, you understand why my hands didn't move for a full 30 seconds. Through the windshield, I could see silhouettes laughing inside the house. No one noticed I had left. Not my husband. Not my family. That silence felt louder than the slap. I broke the seal. Inside were 3 documents: a cover letter, a copy of a property deed, and a draft agreement. I read the first line of Lorraine's letter twice. Hannah, since you and Daniel will soon be transitioning out of the Desert Willow property, we've prepared the necessary paperwork. Transitioning out? We lived in Desert Willow. Our house, or at least I thought it was. The deed attached told a different story. Title holder, Whitmore Family Holdings, LLC. Not Daniel Whitmore. Not Hannah Carter Whitmore. Whitmore Family Holdings. I worked in escrow. I understood real estate language better than most people understood their own marriage, and this document meant one very clear thing. We didn't own our home. We never had. Let me pause here and ask you something. If you discovered the house you'd been paying utilities insurance and maintenance on for 3 years wasn't legally yours, would you confront your spouse immediately, or would you keep reading? I kept reading. The draft agreement was worse. It was labeled Occupancy Termination and Release, a legal document asking me to vacate the property within 60 days and waive any claim to family-owned assets. Assets I didn't even know were structured that way. The date on the draft, prepared 2 weeks earlier, 2 weeks before the birthday party, before the slap, before tonight. This wasn't reaction. This was planning. Tier 1. I didn't have the full truth yet, but I now knew there had been a decision made without me. I pulled out my phone and opened our joint account records, because numbers don't lie. Mortgage payments, none. There were no mortgage payments. Only monthly family contribution transfers to Whitmore Family Holdings. We hadn't been buying a house. We'd been paying rent to Daniel's parents without ever being told. I leaned back in the seat, staring at the ceiling of my car. That strange calm settled in, the one that comes when emotion burns off and logic takes over. This wasn't just humiliation. This was control, and control always leaves a paper trail. At 10:57 p.m., my phone buzzed. "Daniel, where did you go?" he asked when I answered. "Outside." "You're overreacting." Rebecca didn't mean anything by it. I looked down at the documents again. "Daniel," I asked quietly, "why is your mother asking us to move out of a house we don't own?" Silence. Too long. That silence told me everything before he even spoke. "We were going to explain," he said finally. "Going to." Future tense. When I asked. "It's complicated." It wasn't. I deal with complicated for a living. This wasn't complicated. This was concealed. "You knew," I said. "Yes." One word. No apology. That was the second shift inside me. "You let me believe we owned that house," I continued. "It was easier this way." Easier. There's a sentence that should come with a warning label. Let me ask you something. If your partner said deception was easier than honesty, what would that do to your trust? I didn't yell, didn't cry. I asked the only question that mattered. "What else haven't you told me?" Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he said, "Let's talk about this tomorrow." Not tonight. Tomorrow. Delay is a strategy. I use it myself in negotiations, but now I recognized it being used on me. "Daniel," I said calmly, "who drafted this agreement?" Another pause. "Our attorney." "Which one?" He hesitated. That hesitation was new information, because Whitmore Custom Homes had in-house counsel. If he hesitated naming the attorney, then this wasn't standard company work. This was separate, private, intentional. "I'll explain tomorrow," he repeated. I ended the call, not because I was angry, because I had heard enough. I drove home to the house I now knew wasn't ours. and walked inside like nothing had changed. Because tonight wasn't the night for confrontation. Tonight was for observation. In the kitchen, Daniel had already returned. He avoided eye contact. That told me something, too. Guilt behaves differently than arrogance. He wasn't proud of this, but he had participated. I placed Lorraine's envelope on the counter between us. "You should read it again," I said. "I've read it." "Then you know I will, too." We stood there in silence, married, but suddenly on opposite sides of information. Before going upstairs, I asked one more question. "Daniel, why 60 days?" He frowned. "What?" "The agreement gives us 60 days. That's not random. Deadlines are never random in legal drafting. They align with something. A sale, a transfer, a restructuring, something." Daniel looked away. "I don't know." That was a lie. And I knew it, because I've watched hundreds of people lie across closing tables, and they all do the same thing. They stop explaining details. That night, while Daniel slept, I opened my laptop, logged into the county recorder's office database, and searched Whitmore Family Holdings. That's when I found the second layer. There were multiple recent filings. Not just our property. 3 homes, all transferred into the LLC within the last year, and 1 pending transaction scheduled to close in 48 days. 48, inside our 60-day deadline. That's not coincidence. That's coordination. But I still didn't know why. Not yet. Chapter 3 begins with the closing file I was never supposed to see, and the signature that shouldn't have been there. At 1:13 a.m., while Daniel slept upstairs, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open and pulled the pending closing file from the Maricopa County Public Access System. I wasn't supposed to have access to the internal escrow packet, but I was a licensed escrow officer. I knew exactly how to find what hadn't been fully locked down yet, and what I saw made my stomach go cold. Buyer Desert Vista Development Group. Seller Whitmore Family Holdings, LLC. Property address? Our house. Projected closing date April 22nd. 47 days away. They weren't asking us to move out. They were selling the house, without ever telling me. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the authorization page, because there was a marital disclosure acknowledgement attached to the transaction. Arizona is a community property state. If a married couple occupies a primary residence, certain disclosures must reflect both spouses' awareness, even if title is held by an LLC. I know that rule. I enforce that rule. And on that document was my name, Hannah Carter Whitmore, followed by a signature that was not mine. I stared at it for a long time, not shocked, not confused, just still. Let me stop here and ask you something. If you saw your name signed on a legal document you had never touched, would you assume mistake or intention? Because forgery is not a clerical error. Forgery is a decision. I zoomed in. The signature was close enough to pass casual review, but not close enough to fool someone who signs her name 40 times a day. The loops were wrong. The pressure points inconsistent. Someone had tried to copy it. Poorly. Tier 2. Now I knew there were documents, but I didn't yet know who had signed them, or who thought I wouldn't notice. At 1:29 a.m., I checked the notary block. Notary Sandra Klein. Commission valid. Timestamped 2 days earlier, which meant this wasn't some old file. This had happened this week, while I was cooking dinner, while I was sitting across from Daniel watching television, while Rebecca was planning which dress to wear to her mother's birthday party. Someone had forged my consent to sell the home I lived in, and then invited me to a party where they slapped me in front of witnesses. That wasn't coincidence anymore. That was strategy. I printed the page, set it on the table, and waited until morning. At 6:58 a.m., Daniel came downstairs. Coffee. Phone in hand. Routine. Like the ground beneath us hadn't shifted. I slid the paper across the counter. He looked down and froze. Not confusion. Recognition. That told me everything. "Daniel," I said calmly, "who signed my name." He didn't answer. He didn't deny it either. He just sat down. And that silence was louder than any confession. "You knew this was happening," I continued. "It's not what you think," he muttered. That sentence People always say that when it's exactly what you think. Explain it then. He rubbed his face. We needed to move assets. Assets. Not home. Not family. Assets. For what I asked. Another pause. I can't talk about it yet. Yet. There was still something he wasn't telling me. And that meant this wasn't just about property. There was a third layer. I hadn't seen it. Not yet. Let me ask you directly. If someone forged your name and then told you they'd explain later, would you confront them, or would you let them believe they still controlled the timeline? I chose the second, because people reveal more when they think they still have leverage. I'm going to work, I said simply. Daniel looked relieved. Relieved. That told me he thought I was backing down. I wasn't. I drove straight to my office, logged into the secure escrow network, and pulled the full transaction routing history. That's when the third piece surfaced. The buyer's funding source. Not a bank. Not private financing. A legal trust. Name Whitmore Legacy Trust. Created 3 months ago. Trustee Lorraine Whitmore. Beneficiaries listed. Daniel Whitmore. Rebecca Whitmore. Not me. Not mentioned anywhere. They weren't just selling the house. They were restructuring inheritance. Moving properties into a trust before something happened. Before what? That question sat in front of me like a locked door. Because people don't reorganize millions in assets without a reason. And they definitely don't forge signatures unless they're in a hurry. Something was coming. Something they didn't want me involved in. Something big enough to push them into fraud. I leaned back in my chair and whispered the first truth out loud. This isn't about real estate. And for the first time since the slap, I understood. They hadn't humiliated me because I was insignificant. They humiliated me because they thought I was in the way. Chapter 4 begins when I met the attorney they didn't want me to talk to, and heard the word no one had said yet. At 11:06 a.m., I walked into the office of Nathaniel Brooks, Esquire, the attorney listed on the trust formation documents. I didn't have an appointment. I didn't need one. I carried a printed copy of the forged signature. And in Arizona, attorneys get very interested when forgery walks through their door. If you've ever seen a receptionist go from polite to alarmed in under 3 seconds, you know exactly what happened when I slid that page across her desk. I need to speak with Mr. Brooks, I said calmly. This document contains my name. 5 minutes later, I was seated across from him. Nathaniel Brooks was in his late 50s, careful eyes, careful posture. The kind of lawyer who measured every sentence before letting it leave his mouth. He glanced at the paper once, then again. Then he leaned back slowly. Mrs. Whitmore, he said I was under the impression you had already reviewed these materials. That was his first mistake, because that sentence confirmed something critical. They told him I knew. I have not, I replied. Silence filled the room. Real uncomfortable silence. He folded his hands. I believe there has been a misunderstanding. No, I said. There's been a representation issue. I didn't accuse. I didn't threaten. I used the language that forces lawyers to pay attention. Representation issue means liability. Let me pause and ask you something. If you walked into a room and realized professionals had been told a lie about your involvement, would you explode? Or would you stay calm enough to let them correct themselves? Calm wins. Always. Nathaniel Brooks cleared his throat. Your husband indicated you had consented to the restructuring. Did you witness that consent, I asked? No. Did you verify it? Pause. No. That was all I needed. Because now the risk wasn't mine. It was theirs. He looked down again at the signature. I see your concern. Concern. That word does a lot of work in legal settings. I'd like to understand the purpose of this trust, I continued. He hesitated. And in that hesitation, I finally heard it. Estate planning, he said. Estate. There it was. The word no one had said out loud. They weren't just moving assets. They were preparing for death. But whose? Lorraine Whitmore was alive. Sharp. Controlling as ever. So why the rush? Why the secrecy? Why exclude me entirely? I didn't ask those questions directly. Instead, I asked something else. When was the trust funded? Initial transfers began last month. Last month. Before the slap. Before the envelope. Before they decided I needed to be out of the house. Tier 2 was widening. There were documents. There was urgency. But the reason was still hidden. Nathaniel Brooks leaned forward slightly. If you were unaware of these transactions, we need to pause further activity until clarification is obtained. Pause further activity. In escrow language, that means stop the closing, which meant their timeline just cracked. I nodded. That would be appropriate. He picked up the phone. I'll notify all parties we're suspending execution pending verification. All parties, including Daniel, including Lorraine. I thanked him and stood to leave. But before I reached the door, he said something that changed everything. Mrs. Whitmore, I assume you're also aware of the medical directive. I turned back. The what? He blinked. You haven't seen it. Not a question. A realization. Another document. Another secret. Tier 3 was waiting. What medical directive? I asked quietly. Nathaniel Brooks exhaled. I believe that conversation needs to occur within your family. Which meant it was significant, which meant it was the reason all of this was happening, and which meant they had deliberately kept it from me. Let me ask you this. If you discovered your entire life was being reorganized around information you weren't allowed to know, would you confront them immediately, or would you wait until they revealed it themselves? I walked out without another word, because now I understood the structure of what they were doing. First, remove me legally. Second, transfer assets quietly. Third, execute whatever this medical directive was. They weren't just excluding me. They were erasing me before something happened, and that meant whatever was coming soon. At 2:14 p.m., Daniel finally called, his voice tight. You went to Brooks's office. Yes. You weren't supposed to do that. There it was again. Control slipping. You forged my signature, Daniel. We were trying to handle things privately. Private doesn't include forgery, but I didn't say that. Instead, I asked, what medical directive? Silence. Longer this time. Then, we need to talk tonight. Of course we did. Because secrets don't survive daylight. They unravel. And tonight, for the first time, they would have to tell me why they were rearranging millions of dollars. And why they needed me gone first. Chapter 5 begins with the diagnosis they hid, and the condition that changed the meaning of everything. At exactly 7:32 p.m., Daniel placed a manila folder on the dining table between us, and said, Before you read this, you need to understand we were trying to protect the family. Not protect me. Protect the family. That distinction matters. If you've ever heard someone justify a lie with the word protect, you already know the truth is going to hurt more than the deception. I didn't touch the folder immediately, because once you read medical records, you can't unread them. Start talking, I said. Daniel sat across from me but wouldn't meet my eyes. It's Mom, he said. Lorraine. She's sick, he nodded. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 3, diagnosed in November. 3 months ago. Before the trust. Before the property transfers. Before they started pushing me out, the timeline snapped into place. I opened the folder. Mayo Clinic letterhead. Treatment consultations. Oncology summaries. Projected care plan measured not in years, but in months. 6 to 12 depending on response. I read every page carefully. Because I don't skim documents. Documents tell stories. And this one told me Lorraine Whitmore believed she was dying. Let me pause here. If you discovered your in-laws had been planning around a terminal diagnosis they never told you about, would that excuse what they did, or make it worse? I still didn't know the answer. Daniel spoke again. She wanted everything structured before treatment started. No delays, no probate risk, no disputes. Know me, I said. He flinched. It wasn't like that. It was exactly like that. Because I wasn't listed in the trust. Not as beneficiary. Not as spouse acknowledgement. Not anywhere. They hadn't just reorganized assets. They had rewritten the future without me in it. Why hide it, I asked. Daniel rubbed his hands together. She didn't want sympathy. She didn't want drama. She humiliated me at her birthday party. That wasn't about the cancer. No, that was about control. I flipped to the estate summary page. Whitmore Legacy Trust controlled 3 residential properties. 2 commercial parcels, 70% of Whitmore Custom Homes shares, Total estimated value $18.4 million. And every distribution flowed to Daniel and Rebecca directly, not to spouses. That's when I saw the clause. Spousal exclusion provision. A legal mechanism allowed under Arizona trust law to ensure inherited assets remain separate property. They hadn't just planned inheritance. They had insulated it from me. Tier 3 was now fully visible. This wasn't panic. This was strategy. And the forged signature, that was about speed. They needed transactions completed before disclosure created legal complications. I closed the folder. So the solution to your mother's illness, I said quietly, was to erase me from every structure you could. Daniel's voice rose. That's not fair. Fair. That word again. You lied. You forged documents. You removed me from decisions about the home I live in. I said, that's not estate planning. That's manipulation. He didn't deny it. Because he couldn't. Let me ask you something. If grief and control got tangled together like this, would you forgive it or question everything that came before? Daniel leaned forward. We were going to tell you after everything was secured. After I signed away rights I didn't know I had. After they finished transferring millions. After I became irrelevant. You didn't trust me, I said. Daniel shook his head. We didn't want interference. Interference. That's what they called me. That's why Rebecca slapped me. Because in their minds I wasn't family. I was risk. The room went very quiet. Finally, I asked the question that had been building since Chapter 1. Does Lorraine know my signature was forged? Daniel didn't answer. That silence was enough. Which meant Lorraine Whitmore, the woman hosting elegant birthday dinners, the woman laughing while I stood there humiliated, had approved it. And suddenly the slap made sense. It wasn't anger. It was dismissal. They thought I would leave quietly. Instead, I stood up, walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and said the calmest sentence I'd spoken yet. I'm not signing anything. Daniel followed me. You're making this harder. No, I replied. I'm making it legal. Because here's the truth. They wanted control before death forced transparency. But the moment forgery entered the process, they lost the protection they were trying to build. And they didn't realize that yet. At 9:11 p.m., my phone buzzed. A notification from the county recorder's office. Transaction status updated. Closing delayed. Requested review. Nathaniel Brooks had already acted. The machine had stopped. And once stopped, estate transfers don't restart easily. Daniel looked at the notification over my shoulder. What did you do? Nothing, I said. I just told the truth. But inside I knew this wasn't finished. Because families like the Whitmores don't accept loss of control quietly. They escalate, and escalation was coming. Chapter 6 begins the moment Lorraine Whitmore finally confronted me herself and said the one thing she should never have said. At 9:04 a.m. the next morning, Lorraine Whitmore walked into my kitchen without knocking. She still had her own key. Of course she did. Control doesn't surrender access willingly. She wore a cream-colored blazer, perfectly styled hair, and the same expression she used at charity galas, composed, dignified, untouchable. You would never guess she had chemotherapy scheduled that afternoon. If you didn't know better, you'd think she had come to discuss brunch plans. Instead, she sat down at my table and said, "You've complicated things unnecessarily. Not hello, not explanation, not apology. Complicated things. If you've ever dealt with someone who treats betrayal like an inconvenience rather than a wrongdoing, you know exactly what that sentence means." I poured coffee. Not for her. For me. You forged my signature, I said calmly. Lorraine folded her hands. We expedited documentation. No, I replied. You committed fraud. She didn't flinch. That was the first sign this wasn't emotional for her. It was tactical. Everything we did, she said, was to preserve what Daniel and Rebecca are entitled to. Entitled. There it was. The Whitmore family vocabulary always revolved around entitlement legacy preservation. Never trust. Never partnership. Let me ask you something. If someone told you to your face that protecting their children justified removing you from the picture, would you argue? Or would you listen carefully enough to understand their real fear? I listened. Because Lorraine Whitmore wasn't afraid of dying. She was afraid of losing control before she did. You assumed I would interfere, I said. You would have, she answered immediately, by asking questions. Yes. That honesty was almost refreshing. But it also confirmed something darker. She didn't see me as family. She saw me as liability. You embarrassed me last night, she added as if we were discussing table manners. You allowed your daughter to assault me. Lorraine waved a hand dismissively. Rebecca overreacted. But the situation was already emotional. Emotional. That's how she categorized public humiliation. I sat down across from her. Why didn't you just tell me you were sick? Lorraine's expression changed for the first time. Not softer. Sharper. Because illness invites weakness, she said. And weakness invites opportunists. I realized then she didn't hide the diagnosis out of pride. She hid it out of suspicion. She believed transparency would give me leverage. That was the real betrayal. She had never trusted me. Not once in 5 years of marriage. Tier 3 wasn't just legal. It was psychological. Let me pause here. If someone builds an entire strategy around excluding you because they assume the worst about you, can that relationship ever be repaired? Lorraine leaned forward. All we required was your cooperation. Sign the occupancy release. Allow the transfers. Daniel will still be provided for. You will still be comfortable. Comfortable. Like a stipend. Like an afterthought. You mean controlled, I said. She didn't deny it. This family survives because we plan, she replied. Not because we invite chaos. Chaos. That's what she called my existence. The room went quiet again. Then she made her mistake. You're not part of the inheritance structure, she said. And you never were meant to be. There it was. The sentence that stripped everything down to truth. Not temporary exclusion. Permanent design. I felt something inside me settle. Not anger. Clarity. You should have just said that 5 years ago, I replied. Lorraine stood. You can still make this easy. I shook my head. It stopped being easy when you forged my name. For the first time, she looked uncertain. Not afraid, but aware. Because she finally understood something. I wasn't reacting emotionally. I was documenting. And documentation changes outcomes. She gathered her purse. We'll resolve this through counsel, she said. Yes, I answered. We will. No shouting. No drama. Just process. She left. The front door closed. And I sat there listening to the silence she left behind. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about lines. Lines they crossed. Lines I was about to draw. At 11:27 a.m., I received an email from Nathaniel Brooks. Subject formal review requested. Lorraine's attorneys had responded. They wanted a mediated family meeting. One meeting, all parties present. Before any further estate transfers. That meeting would determine everything. And unlike birthday dinners, this one would be on record. Chapter 7 begins the quiet before that meeting. Because when families stop arguing, they start preparing. At 6:12 a.m., the morning after Lorraine's visit, the Whitmore house felt different. Not louder, not tenser, quieter. And that kind of quiet is never peaceful. It's strategic. No one called. No texts from Daniel's sister, Rebecca Whitmore. No carefully worded messages from Lorraine. Even Daniel, who still lived under the same roof as me, moved through the kitchen like a guest in a hotel. If you've ever experienced that kind of silence in a family conflict, you know it's not avoidance. It's calculation. They weren't arguing anymore. They were preparing. And so was I. Let me ask you something. If the people who tried to control the narrative suddenly stopped talking altogether, would that make you relax? Or would it make you more alert? I chose alert, because quiet means documents are moving. Lawyers are drafting. Strategies are shifting. And unlike emotional fights, those things leave permanent consequences. I drove to my office that morning and requested personal leave. Not because I needed time off. Because I needed time to think without interruption. I sat at my desk, opened a legal pad, and wrote 3 sentences. Not emotional ones. Structural ones. They excluded me intentionally. They forged consent to accelerate control. Now they want mediation to legitimize what they already attempted. When you reduce conflict to structure, it stops feeling personal. It becomes solvable. At 9:38 a.m., Daniel finally spoke. Not face-to-face. An email. Subject mediation agenda. No greeting. Just an attachment. A draft outlining what they expected from the meeting. Occupancy termination within 60 days. Acknowledgement that the property was never jointly owned. Waiver of claims against Whitmore Family Holdings. And a confidentiality clause. That last part made me stop. Confidentiality. They didn't just want agreement. They wanted silence. Silence protects reputations, especially in industries built on trust. Whitmore Custom Homes closed nearly 140 transactions a year. If questions about forged signatures surfaced publicly, that number would drop. Fast. I leaned back in my chair. This wasn't just family damage control. It was business risk management, and suddenly their urgency made more sense. But they still misunderstood something. I didn't want exposure. I wanted autonomy. There's a difference. Let me pause here. If you were offered a clean exit, money relocation support, no public conflict, would you take it? Or would you demand accountability first? I didn't answer that question yet, because the meeting hadn't happened, and information still mattered more than emotion. At 11:02 a.m., my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I almost ignored it, but instinct told me not to. "This is Sandra Klein," the voice said. "The notary, the same notary listed on the forged document. I believe there's been a misunderstanding regarding a signature I witnessed," she said carefully. Interesting. She wasn't calling to defend herself. She was calling because something felt wrong to her too. "I'd like to clarify what occurred," she added. I scheduled to meet her that afternoon. Because when professionals start protecting themselves, they start telling the truth. And truth adds weight. At 2:15 p.m., we met at a small cafe off Camelback Road. Sandra looked nervous, not guilty, concerned. "I notarized Daniel's acknowledgement," she explained. "But I never witnessed you sign anything." I didn't interrupt. "I was told you had pre-signed," she continued, "that you couldn't attend in person." There it was. Misrepresentation. Daniel hadn't just forged my name. He had used process shortcuts to make it appear legitimate. Sandra slid her notary journal across the table. My name wasn't there, only Daniel's. That meant the notarization didn't validate my signature at all. Legally, it weakened their position more than they realized. Sandra looked at me. "I don't want to be involved in something improper." "You're not," I said. "You're clarifying facts." Facts. That's all this needed to be. When I left the cafe, I didn't feel vindicated. I felt prepared, because now I understood something important. They had built their plan quickly, too quickly, and rushed plans leave seams. The mediation wasn't about deciding the future. It was about confronting those seams before they split open. That evening, Daniel finally spoke to me directly. "We don't want this to get ugly," he said. I looked at him. It already did. He didn't argue. He couldn't. Then he asked something unexpected. "What do you want, Hannah? Not what will you accept. What do you want?" I answered honestly. "I want to stop being managed." That was the first truthful exchange we'd had in weeks, and it didn't solve anything. But it changed the tone, because now he understood this wasn't about inheritance. It wasn't about revenge. It was about dignity. The mediation was scheduled for Friday at 10:00 a.m. Neutral office, recorded session, attorneys present, one meeting, one chance to resolve everything before it escalated further. As I prepared my documents that night, I realized something strange. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger had burned off. What remained was focus, and focus is far more dangerous to a broken structure than rage ever is. Chapter 8 begins the preparation they didn't see, because while they were trying to settle, I was deciding what settlement actually meant. At 5:55 a.m. on Thursday, the day before mediation, I woke up before my alarm and didn't check my phone. No messages mattered that morning. Preparation did. If you've ever walked into a situation where everyone assumes you'll react emotionally, there's power in doing the opposite. I made coffee, opened my laptop, and began organizing what I called my timeline of intent. not accusations. Intent, because courts and mediators don't care about feelings. They care about sequence. November, Lorraine Whitmore diagnosed. December, trust created excluding spouses. January, property transfers accelerated. February, my signature forged. Birthday party, public humiliation immediately before forced occupancy exit. That last line wasn't emotional commentary. It was context. Because timing is evidence. Let me ask you something. If someone tried to push you out quietly, would you walk away just to keep the peace? Or would you make sure the truth of how it happened was acknowledged? I wasn't planning to fight for their money. I was making sure they couldn't rewrite the story. At 7:40 a.m., Daniel left for work without saying goodbye. We had moved into that strange coexistence where conversation only happened when necessary. That told me something too. He wasn't confident anymore. He was waiting to see how this would end. At 9:15 a.m., I met with my own attorney for the first time. Elena Ruiz, 39. Precise. Calm. The kind of lawyer who doesn't waste words because she doesn't need to. After reviewing everything, she asked me one question. Do you want compensation or do you want separation? I didn't hesitate. Separation. She nodded. That's cleaner and harder for them because compensation implies negotiation. Separation implies boundaries. Elena outlined Arizona statutes regarding fraudulent inducement and marital disclosure rights, not to pursue litigation, but to establish leverage if needed. We won't threaten, she said. We'll clarify. That was exactly what I wanted. Clarification forces honesty. At 11:02 a.m., she added something else. They're afraid of reputational damage, she said. That's why mediation is happening so quickly. Not grief. Not reconciliation. Risk management. I appreciated the confirmation. Let me pause again. If you realized the apology you might receive was motivated by fear, not remorse, would you still need it? I didn't. What I needed was freedom from their structure. That afternoon, I returned home and began packing. Not dramatically, not angrily, just methodically. Documents first, then personal things. Because psychologically, movement matters. It reminds you that you're not stuck. At 3:18 p.m., Rebecca finally texted me. You've blown this way out of proportion. I read it twice, then didn't reply. Silence is also a response, especially to someone who had never apologized for striking me. At 6:30 p.m., Daniel came home earlier than usual. He stood in the doorway of the bedroom, watching me fold clothes. You're already leaving, he said. I'm preparing, I answered. He didn't argue. Instead, he asked quietly, is there anything I can say that changes this? That question hung there longer than anything else he'd said in weeks, because now it wasn't about strategy. It was personal. I thought about it and answered honestly. You could have trusted me with the truth. He nodded once. That's fair. No defense, no justification. Just acceptance. Sometimes accountability arrives too late to repair anything, but it still matters. That night I reviewed the mediation outline one last time. They would propose timelines, asset clarifications, exit logistics, and confidentiality. But they still didn't know what I was going to say, because what I planned to ask for wasn't money. It wasn't apology. It was acknowledgement on record of what had happened, and once recorded it couldn't be rewritten. I went to bed early, not anxious, not angry, just ready, because the next day wasn't a fight. It was a turning point, and turning points are quiet. Chapter 9 begins the morning of mediation, and the moment I realized they were far more nervous than I was. At 9:12 a.m. on Friday, I pulled into the parking lot of the mediation office 15 minutes early. Neutral building, beige walls, no signage except a small plaque Southwest Resolution Services. No one chooses that place for celebrations, only for endings. If you've ever walked into a room knowing a relationship is about to change permanently, not explode, not reconcile, just change, the strange calm that comes with it. I sat in my car for a moment watching Daniel's vehicle already parked there. He was early too. That told me something. Confidence doesn't arrive early. Anxiety does. Let me ask you this. If the people who once dismissed you suddenly looked nervous, would you feel vindicated or just certain you were finally being taken seriously? I stepped out and walked inside. The waiting room smelled like coffee and carpet cleaner. Daniel stood when he saw me. Not defensive, not distant, just unsure. "Morning," he said. "Morning." We sat across from each other without speaking. A few minutes later, Lorraine Whitmore arrived accompanied by her attorney. She looked smaller than she had in my kitchen days earlier. Not weak, just tired. Treatment had already begun. Reality had entered the room. Rebecca came last, still carrying that edge of indignation like armor. And then Elena Ruiz walked in beside me, placed a folder on the table, and gave me a small nod. Everything was ready. At 10:03 a.m., the mediator, Charles Denton, opened the session. "This process is confidential and voluntary," he began. "We're here to reach clarity and agreement, not assign blame." Clarity, that was the word I'd been waiting for. Lorraine's attorney spoke first, outlining their proposal. Orderly transition out of the residence. Financial assistance for relocation. Acknowledgement that the property was held solely by Whitmore Family Holdings. Mutual non-disparagement. Confidentiality. They spoke like this was logistics, not fallout. Then it was Elena's turn. She didn't argue. Didn't accuse. She simply placed the notarization record, the unsigned acknowledgement, and the forged signature comparison on the table. Before discussing outcomes, she said we need the record to reflect how we arrived here. Silence followed, because facts are louder when no one is raising their voice. Lorraine looked at the documents, then at me, not angry, not defensive, resigned. Stage 1 had passed already denial. We were now in Stage 2, explanation. "This was done too quickly," Lorraine said. "I wanted certainty before treatment." Rebecca shifted in her chair. "We were trying to avoid conflict. Avoid conflict by creating one." Charles Denton leaned forward. "The question isn't intent," he said. "It's acknowledgement." That was the moment the room stopped posturing. Daniel spoke next. "We should have told Hannah from the beginning. Simple. Direct. Late. But true. Let me pause here. If the people who hurt you finally admitted they were wrong, not dramatically, just plainly, would that be enough?" For me, it wasn't about enough. It was about closure. Lorraine took a breath. "I excluded you because I didn't trust what would happen if circumstances became uncertain," she said to me. There it was. Not softened. Not hidden. I see now that secrecy created exactly what I was trying to prevent. That sentence mattered more than any apology could. 'Cause it was honest. Stage 3 justification had passed. We were entering Stage 4, acceptance. Elena slid one final document forward. A revised agreement. Not a waiver. Not silence. A clean separation of residence finances and future obligations. No confidentiality clause. No narrative control. Just independence. Charles reviewed it carefully. "This allows both parties to disengage without ongoing claims," he said. Lorraine nodded slowly. Daniel signed first. Then Lorraine. Rebecca hesitated, but signed. When the paper reached me, I didn't rush. Because signatures are powerful. They don't just close deals. They close chapters. I signed. Not because I lost. Not because I won. Because the structure we built together no longer existed. And forcing it to remain would only cause more damage. The meeting ended at 12:18 p.m. No one shook hands. No one argued. We simply stood, gathered our things, and walked out separately. As I reached the door, Daniel said quietly, "I never meant for it to turn into this." I answered the only way that was still honest. "It didn't turn into this. It was built this way." And then I left. Chapter 10 begins with what happened after the papers were signed. Because endings don't feel like revenge. They feel like space. At 1:47 p.m., less than 2 hours after mediation ended, I unlocked the front door of the house for what I knew would be one of the last times. Nothing inside had changed. Same gray sectional, same framed photos, same kitchen where Lorraine had told me I was never meant to be part of the inheritance. But it didn't feel like my home anymore. Not because I was being forced out. 'cause I finally understood it never truly belonged to me. If you've ever stayed somewhere long after realizing you were only a guest, you know that strange emotional detachment that comes with packing your own life into boxes. There was no anger left, just efficiency. Let me ask you something. When something ends without a fight, does it feel like defeat or relief? For me, it felt like air returning to a room that had been sealed. I started with the practical things. Documents, clothes, my grandmother's dishes, the only objects in that house that had nothing to do with Whitmore history. At 3:05 p.m., Daniel came home. He stood in the doorway again watching. That seemed to be his role lately, witnessing consequences. "You don't have to rush," he said. "I'm not rushing." And I wasn't. I was reclaiming. He walked into the kitchen slowly. "We'll finalize everything with escrow next week," he added, defaulting back to business language. That almost made me smile. Even now we spoke like colleagues closing a file, because in a way we were. Our marriage had become a transaction neither of us knew how to renegotiate. "I'll transfer utilities by Friday," I said. "You'll want continuity for the sale." Daniel nodded. "Thank you. Thank you. Not I'm sorry. Not please stay. Just acknowledgement." And strangely, that was enough. Later that evening, Rebecca texted, "No apology. Just this didn't have to happen." I didn't respond, because some people only understand conflict through the lens of inconvenience, and I wasn't interested in explaining myself anymore. At 7:22 p.m., I taped the first moving box shut. That sound cardboard ceiling felt more final than the mediation agreement, because this was action, not discussion, not theory, movement. Over the next 2 days, I relocated into a short-term furnished apartment across town. Neutral space. No shared memories. No inherited expectations. Just clean walls and quiet mornings. And for the first time in months, no one walked in without knocking. Let me pause again. If freedom comes from losing something you once fought to keep, is it still loss or is it transformation? Monday morning, I returned to work. My colleagues didn't ask questions. Escrow offices run on discretion. Files close. New ones open. That rhythm grounded me again. At 10:11 a.m., I handled a closing for a young couple buying their first home. They asked 100 nervous questions. Read every page. Held hands while signing. It struck me how different honesty looks compared to control. One builds ownership. The other manufactures compliance. By Wednesday, the Whitmore property listing went live. Professional photos. Carefully staged rooms. No trace of what had happened there. That's how real estate works. Spaces get rewritten. But people remember. Daniel emailed once more logistical details only. We never spoke about reconciliation, because we both knew this wasn't something to repair. It was something to conclude. And conclusions don't need drama. They need clarity. Chapter 11 begins with the one conversation that still had to happen. Not with Daniel, not with Rebecca, but with Lorraine. At 4:36 p.m. on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, Lorraine Whitmore asked me to meet her at the Oncology Center Cafe. Not her house, not an office, not a lawyer's conference room. A small, neutral place where no one owned the space. That alone told me this conversation was different. If you've ever sat across from someone when there's nothing left to negotiate, only things left unsaid, you know how still those moments feel. Lorraine looked thinner than the last time I'd seen her. Treatment had taken something from her. Not her composure, but her sharp edges. She didn't stand when I approached, just gestured to the chair across from her. "Thank you for coming," she said. No formal tone, no authority, just direct. I sat. We watched people move past us for a moment. Nurses' families, quiet conversations happening everywhere. Life continuing around difficult realities. "I wanted to speak without attorneys," she said finally. I nodded. "That's fine." She folded her hands. "I spent most of my life believing control prevented chaos," she said. I built everything around that assumption. I didn't interrupt, because this wasn't an apology yet. It was reflection. When I got sick, she continued, I reacted the only way I knew how. I tightened my grip. She looked up at me. And in doing that, I treated you like a variable instead of a person. There it was, not dramatic, but honest. Let me pause here. If someone finally understood the harm they caused without excuses, without asking for forgiveness, would you need anything more? I didn't want your money, I said quietly. I know that now, Lorraine replied. She reached into her bag and slid a small envelope across the table. Not legal documents, not agreements, just a handwritten note. You don't have to open it here, she said. I didn't, because whatever was inside wasn't about negotiation anymore. It was closure. Lorraine leaned back slightly. You were never the threat, she said. My fear was. That sentence stayed with me. Fear builds walls, but it also blinds the people behind them. We sat in silence for a few moments longer. No attempt to repair the relationship. No promises about the future. Because some relationships don't return to what they were. They evolve into something quieter, more distant, but honest. As I stood to leave, Lorraine added one last thing. You didn't fight us, she said. You just refused to disappear. I met her eyes. That was the only thing I needed to do. And that was enough. Chapter 12 is the final chapter. Not about revenge. About what life looks like after you stop trying to belong, where you were never meant to fit.